this email? What does it mean?
Communication is the imparting or exchanging of information or
The
news.
single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place.
Conversation is the oral exchange of sentiments, observations, opinions, or ideas.
Forbes Books Radio presents The Conversation with Clinton M. Paget.
Today's guest has spent his career studying something that most of us experience every day but rarely stop to examine: groups. Whether we're leading a project team, running a business, serving on an executive team, or even participating in our families and communities, we're constantly working through groups. And yet much of what we believe about leadership, teamwork, and performance is built around the individual rather than the collective. My guest today is Dr. Colin Fisher. Colin is a professor, author, speaker, and often, instead of occasional as what I had written, often jazz trumpet player. He's the author of The Collective Edge, Unlocking the Secret Power of Groups, a fascinating book that challenges the myths of the lone genius and explores how cooperation, conformity, competition, and leadership shape the groups we belong to every day. His research on group dynamics, creativity, improvisation, and leadership has been published in top academic journals and featured in outlets including Harvard Business Review, Forbes, Fortune, The Economist, Financial Times, NPR, and the BBC. He currently serves as Associate Professor and PhD Program Director at University College London School of Management and earned his PhD in Organizational Behavior from Harvard University. Since most meaningful work today isn't accomplished by individuals, it's accomplished through teams, I'm so happy to have Colin join us today. Colin, welcome to the conversation.
Thanks so much for having me, Clint. Looking forward to talking with you.
I appreciate you joining me all the way from the UK. So that's always getting these time zones synced up isn't always easy.
No, I know. You have to keep this sort of late afternoon time if you're an American living in the UK.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I like to think of all of the guests that come on my show as superheroes, and all superheroes have an origin story. So how does a kid from Washington State end up in the UK? What's your origin story?
Yeah, I mean, you've already given away part of it. So if it's a movie, we'd have spoiled it already. But so my origin story was, being a kid from the suburbs of Seattle, Redmond, Washington, now of Microsoft fame, but it wasn't really there when I was growing up. They took away the hill that had all the rabbits in it, and now there's a Microsoft campus, and I got really interested in jazz and really love just the feeling of improvising in groups. And it was really, as someone who has a really analytical side too, as you might imagine from getting a PhD at the other end of it, it was a place where you can't have that analytical side when you're improvising in a group, that you have to shut that part of yourself off. And for me, I got really, really obsessed with that to the point that I decided to pursue a career in music. I went to New England Conservatory of Music for my undergrad, much to my parents' chagrin, didn't even apply to sort of normal universities. So I had a, brief career as a professional musician, about 12 years. Playing, touring around, teaching music and doing the things that we do as musicians. But when I moved down to New York, so I lived in Boston for my undergraduate degree. Like many jazz musicians who go to school in Boston, we then moved down to New York to see if we can make it on a little bit bigger stage. I hedged my bets a little bit and started a master's degree in what I like to call crap I made up. Which is a program that they have at NYU that they call individualized study. But I looked at improvisation across different art forms and different musical traditions. And as I was working on my master's thesis for this degree, I stumbled on work about the social psychology of creativity that was written by this woman, Teresa Amabile. And, I became really interested in how she had, was studying creativity in a pretty scientific way, and really figured out a credible way to measure it, and had created a lot of knowledge about the conditions under which we could be most creative. And I was thinking about PhD programs, so I looked her up. It turned out that she was in this field called organizational behavior, which I had never heard of, at this school called Harvard, which I had heard of. And so I ended up saying, I want to take this further. I want to study the conditions under which teams can improvise creatively. And I don't think that's something that's just about the arts. I think that's something that's everywhere in our world, that we have this need to navigate group dynamics in real time, to figure out how to act, and to create things that no one of us could have thought of on our own. And so I applied to work with her at Harvard. For whatever reason, they thought that was a good idea. And, the rest is kind of history after that, I've spent the past 2 decades thinking really deeply, studying, conducting research on teamwork and creativity in all kinds of different organizations, all kinds of different kinds of work, and then, put that together in this book and in the kind of work I'm doing now.
Well, I have to admit, you just helped me out with something else, because my son, as I mentioned before we started recording, he's going into his freshman year of college. He was asking me, hey, what should I study? And now I know you should take the CMU, crap I made up.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Study what you want. You'll end up somewhere.
I can see it now, too, is when you're telling your parents where you wanted to go for undergrad. They're like, I didn't know they had an engineering program there.
Yeah. Yeah.
So before we really get officially started, I wanted to say this book was not only educational, but man, it took me on a journey I did not expect. Right out of the gate, we're talking about the Sorting Hat from Harry Potter, then it's off to the Emergency Rescue Committee and saving lives from the Nazis, and we end with a story about 2 very different outcomes at a hospital using the same procedure. In between, we're talking about Miles Davis, IDEO, the Dream Team, the Scream Team, the Borg from Sidetrack, one of my favorites, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the Bay of Pigs. We learned about the Robbers Cave experiment, and I got to tell you, man, psychology experiments back in the day were off the chains. I'm glad there's some guardrails now. The Science of Revenge, a certain author's first trip to Vegas, and the Pig and Potato War of 1859, which I can't wait to get into. Oh, and I learned a new word, which is always good for me. I think it's portmanteau, which means when you take 2 words and you blend them together to make a new word. So this book, and I learned, just a lot about teams and groups. So, the way you wrote the book and the journey you took us on was amazing. I just think you're a great author.
Oh, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I think, groups, part of why I wrote this book was that groups do have a little bit of an image problem in the world, that when you say group project or meeting, that, people's eyes don't really light up. And, the science of groups, there's so much great science being done, but the terminology itself doesn't always roll off the tongue. I singled out one of the words early in the book, group entitativity, which, is a really important concept, but it's not going to catch on because of the language we use. So a lot of these stories and the examples are trying to help people have a way in and see how much a part of our lives, a part of our culture, these group dynamics really are.
Yeah, I wasn't even going to try to pronounce that word, so.
Yeah, I had to practice.
Yeah. Sure you did. Speaking of superheroes, you wrote that cooperation is a superpower that has enabled us to take over the planet. Why is it so important, and what roles do group dynamics and group synergy play into that? Because I think they were all kind of 3 tied together.
Yeah, absolutely. That if we imagine a world where we didn't have a really strong cooperative instinct, we'd be much more like orangutans or something, where, orangutans are a good example of a primate that actually doesn't live in social groups. And, they're great animals. They have great lives, but they're, not able to kind of take advantage of the fact that, they have to sleep, that when they're asleep, no one's watching out for them, that, they can't take advantage of, new opportunities to build and learn socially in the way that humans have. And that actually, if we look at social creatures on planet Earth, it seems like a pretty darn good strategy that, ants and termites, are some of the most successful insects, and that human beings are, pretty much the most successful mammals. And it's because we've, used our intellect to figure out how to work together, not just in one way, the way ants do, right? Like we don't have one role that we're locked into for life, but that we can deploy this flexibly. We can do this for new tasks. We can learn from one another, and that we can become really more than the sum of our parts, which is what this concept of synergy is. That just like I was talking about with music, we can think of things that no one of us could have thought of alone. And that really has been our superpower that's allowed us to advance as a society, to develop, this wonderful and terrible world that we all live in.
Well, I live in groups because I do project management for a living. And to me, it's I don't care how smart you are. The collective is always greater and smarter than the individual. I mean, it's just true. So,
yeah, absolutely. This idea that there are lone geniuses who are out there, coming up with ideas that are better than what the groups could do is largely a myth. I mean, there are of course, times where stuff like that happens, or that we could attribute most of the credit to somebody. But when you dig underneath, even the most famous inventions, the new businesses that are started in the world, you find that, if there's one individual associated with it, it's often somebody that had some skill in kind of claiming that credit for themselves. But it's also baked into our psychology as people perceiving the world, that we understand and remember stories that have a single individual at its core, that have a hero who's the protagonist or a villain, and that because of that, we tend to write out groups over time. So as we get more distant from when something happens, we start saying, no, it's just this one individual. It's Attila the Hun, it's Napoleon, it's Steve Jobs or whatever it is, and that the other people who were involved in this and were really part of kind of a core team who was helping to make this all possible start to fall away from the story as we get farther and farther away.
Yeah, Steve Jobs is a great example because then you ignore Steve Wozniak and some of the other guys who you do know about, but you don't think of them as the hero when they played a pretty significant role. Yeah. And early in the book, you actually give some examples, like pop quiz guest or people listening who invented the light bulb, which it actually wasn't who you think it was, right? Yeah. You just made it, I guess, mass producible. So.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, it's funny. The incandescent light bulb was invented long before Thomas Edison was born. Well, not super long, but a bit before he was born. And that really, Edison oversaw this huge lab where he had assembled, a bunch of great engineers that he, I guess lovingly called his muckers. We'll
go with that.
Yeah, it was actually, I was trying to find the names of these people, and it's hard. Like, I mean, I could find information on a few of them, but that they truly are, a lot of them, lost to history. But that, Edison was not somebody who was sitting alone in his basement toiling away on this invention. He was, the head of a large, innovation laboratory that, had a bunch of different groups that were working on different projects at its core. And, that's still the way we do things. Yet most of us imagine Edison, sitting alone in a garage or in a basement somewhere working on these little experiments. But that's not at all what happened.
No, in fact, you talk about it that kind of that ended, the single inventor kind of ended back in the days of Newton sitting under the tree and, things like that. And those people really were, probably by themselves. The rest of us are now using groups.
Yeah, and who even knows? I mean, like I said, the further we get away in time, the harder it is to track down what really happened.
That's true. You say that seeing the world from a collective perspective is transformative. What is collective perspective, and why is it so impactful?
So a collective perspective means to get out of this mindset where we are asking for a clear protagonist, a clear hero or villain who gets the credit or the blame for what we see happening out in the world. And this, again, is hard. It takes conscious effort to do this because our brains are hardwired to remember things in this fashion. So we have to, kind of put on this set of glasses that say, all right, rather than thinking, oh, Clint's able to, run this successful podcast because, he's so smart and he's so talented, to say, wait a minute, I want to look more about the situation. I want to look for the influences of groups on what's happening. And that I want to not look at individuals as the only one who has the ability to create, to make, to build. But I want to look at groups as the thing that has the ability to do that. And that once you do that, you start to see it's everywhere. That almost every aspect of your life is, shaped by the groups that you're a part of. And that even when you look at your own behavior, you'll see when you change groups, you yourself are going to behave very, very differently. That you probably don't behave the same way at your own kitchen table with your family as you do when you go into the office and are working with your work team. And that we think, oh no, it's just me, it's the same person. But that this is the influence of groups and situations on our own action. And that's happening everywhere.
Yeah, it's if you think about it, what you just said is completely true, because I catch myself sometimes talking to my son or my daughter and think I would never talk to somebody in the office that way. I got to stop, and you got to level set yourself. So,
yeah.
I mean, I was speaking to them nicely, of course.
Yeah.
Despite the fact they just spilled something on the floor that's paint and I got to fix it.
Yeah. Hopefully not oil based.
No, that was on the carpet. That was a different story.
Okay,
So. So you discussed the fundamental attribution error, the tendency to explain outcomes through individuals rather than circumstances and groups. How does that bias affect leadership and talent decisions?
I mean, it's not just biasing leadership decisions and talent decisions. The fundamental attribution error has shaped how we create performance management and hiring and everything in organizations. So the fundamental attribution error is this hardwired tendency to attribute individuals and their dispositions, their personality, their traits, their character, as the causes of their behavior. And so it's, this is so important that psychologists have called it fundamental, and that it's an attribution, meaning that's us trying to attribute causality for what happens. So, the classic example here is, if somebody is late to a meeting, your first thought is most likely that they're late because they're flaky, because they're disorganized, or because they don't care. Something internal to them. It's less likely that your first thought is going to be, oh, they're late because of some situation that they were in, that there was a traffic accident nearby, that they had to care for a loved one, who had something had happened to on their way out the door. And that these kind of situational attributions tend to be our brain's second or third thought rather than their first thought. And it's an error because, as we were talking about, this is usually wrong, that people behave the way they do as a function of both their personality and their situations, but that on average, actually, situations are more powerful than personalities are. That if we think, of really strong situations, like if there's a fire in a building, we're actually all going to behave relatively similarly. Like your personality is not going to shape our behavior that much. It will at the margins. And the stronger the situation, the less effect personality has. So that the fundamental attribution error is just this tendency to ignore situations and focus only on personality. Now that's a problem because when we're looking for how to fix our organizations, how to fix teams, if we say, oh, there's this one person, it's Steve, and he's the reason the team did well, or he's the reason the team did poorly, and so the solution to that is to reward or punish Steve. But most of the time, we'd be much better off if we thought about the group and how it's interacting as the causes of these dynamics, and also the group as the place to intervene when we want change. So not just to reward and punish the individuals involved, but to actually think about how do we support the team? Can we affect change and learning where we need to? Or where can we provide a better context, a better situation for groups to actually thrive?
Yeah, I think later in the book you even mentioned, you talk about replacing Steve doesn't always help.
No.
It's not Steve, it's really not the issue.
Yeah, I mean, if you find yourself doing this more than once, you might want to really think about the situation that you've created in a group, because although I don't want to say that there's no such thing as bad apples and people who can't undermine team dynamics. Of course, there absolutely are. But if you find yourself thinking that that's happening more than once or twice in your organization, either you've got a problem with your selection criteria. And it's like, well, who are you hiring into your organization in the first place that's, so toxic that they can't function and work with other people at all? Or that more likely, you've got groups that are lacking something that's really essential, one of these essential conditions for them to be successful.
Right. Yeah, we see that on project teams all the time. And sometimes you do have a bad apple that you just, they're and it doesn't happen. I mean, I've been doing my job for over 30 years, and I can count on one finger the number of times it's happened to me. But sometimes you do have to say, this person is just not a team player. We can't work with them. But normally it's a conversation, or you fix something else, and then things move along pretty quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. And that those bad apple situations, they tend to stick in our minds, right? That I think it's always useful to remind ourselves that our brains, unfortunately, are biased towards negativity, that bad is stronger than good in our memories, and that we remember these kind of negative events more vividly than we do positive events. So therefore, when we have these bad apple experiences, we develop all these systems to guard against them, when in fact, it's actually a relatively rare occurrence in most organizations, especially organizations that otherwise have healthy processes and healthy cultures, but that people behave badly in bad situations more often than they do in good situations.
That's true. And it carries over into sports. If you ask any coach, they'll always say they remember the losses way more than they remember the wins.
Yeah.
Even if it's a big win. I mean, you talk about Coach K in the book and some other coaches. So, I mean, that's just you're right. It's the way we're wired. And I wish it wasn't that way sometimes, because I don't want to focus on the negative, but it does go there first, and I have to force myself off.
Yeah. I mean, it's, our brains are always, first and foremost wired to have kept us alive in a dangerous environment. And so, remembering bad stuff and avoiding it again is a useful evolutionary adaptation. But it's not as helpful in most people's modern lives, where we're not, warding off threats or having to remember which snake is poisonous and which one is not so poisonous. Yeah, exactly.
So another word I had never seen before, although I like it, you introduced the concept of groupiness. What exactly is groupiness, and how can leaders recognize whether they have a real team or just a collection of people?
So I'm glad groupiness was a new word to you, because as far as I know, I made it up.
Okay.
So groupiness was essentially my substitute for this word entitativity that I was poking a little fun at earlier.
It's definitely easier to say.
Yeah, and that the idea is that when we say group, we could mean a lot of different things. That we could mean anything from broad social categories like being an American or being a musician, to our work teams or our families, and that these are really different things. But that although a lot of people think of there's like a very bright line between having a team and just being a group, in reality it's more of a continuum, and that what we want is to if we need to actually collaborate and be interdependent, you're better off being as high on this groupiness scale as you possibly can be. And the highest you can be is what we call a real team. And that means you've got bounded, recognizable membership, which means everyone knows who's on the team and who's not on the team. We are interdependent, meaning literally we depend on one another, that what your work affects the work that I do, and that we share at least one, but often more than one, common goal. And that if we have those things, that we have a much higher likelihood of actually achieving this being more than the sum of our parts, of achieving synergy than we do. And that the less of those things we have, the harder it is for us to get synergy. And the closer we are to just being a crowd sitting at a bus stop, or, a co-acting group where we're in, maybe these largely defunct call centers now where everyone's sitting and they've got their own individual task, but we still call them a team. There you don't have a lot of hope of these, being more than the sum of our parts. And it's really only when we create that interdependence, that sense of a bounded team with some stability of membership, and that we have these common goals, that we really can harvest most of the benefits of groupiness.
It was interesting is I didn't expect this, but first of all, I did read everything because you said keep reading if you want to know some oxen jokes. So I learned about the yoke too. Yeah. But it was interesting that my brain says that if I put two people on something, I'll go twice as fast. But we found that that's actually not the case, right? That sometimes it slows you down.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it was the Brooks's law that said, if you want a project to go slower, add another designer on it, and then it'll slow it down. And there's some truth to that, and that's what where I was talking about oxen and this phenomenon that we now call social loafing, or that people commonly know as free riding, means when we're in a group situation, the more people there are, the less individual accountability I feel. So that it's like, oh, there's 10 people who could do this. I as an individual feel a little bit less accountable for, I'm the one who has to do it. And that this happens even without our awareness. So, these experiments that a French kind of agricultural scientist, Maximilien Ringelmann, was doing, was trying to figure out, what's the optimal number of oxen to pull a cart. And, what he was finding was that, mostly it seemed like a coordination problem. When you've got 6 oxen hooked to a cart, they're going to get in each other's way. It's harder to kind of get them all pulling the same direction because they might go different places. And he did his experiment, because it's hard to do these experiments with just oxen, with humans pulling on a rope. And then what he started to find, though, what really surprised him, was that it wasn't just a coordination problem. It seemed like when more people were pulling on the rope, each person was pulling less hard than they did when they were alone. And so then, 100 years later, they started really doing more rigorous experiments on this. And one of my favorite was by Biblatane and their colleagues, where they asked people to clap as loud as they can. And then they put them in a soundproof room with headphones and told them either that they were clapping alone or that they were clapping with other people, and they were going to sum up their contributions. And they found even just believing you're clapping alongside other people, we don't try as hard. And so this phenomenon of social loafing is part of what's going on. When we say we add more people to a project, we're going to slow it down. But that's often because we all try a little bit less hard. And it's also because we're adding these coordination costs, that there's, one more misunderstanding that could happen between different people the more each person you add. And that this, unfortunately, is not a linear function, right? Like when we add one person to a 6-person group, we're not just getting one more relationship, we're getting 7 more relationships, right? That's coming from that. And those are all opportunities for us to be pulling in slightly different directions, to misunderstand one another, to, have some kind of problem that are the kind of classic problems of groups. So, the message of all this is actually that we can be more than the sum of our parts, but that it's a lot easier when we have smaller groups rather than larger groups. And that when we get these very large groups that are 10, 20, 30 people, that both effort and coordination really start to suffer.
So the math side of my brain is saying 1 + 1 in groups is 1.5.
Yeah. Well, so this was really part of what got my mentor Richard Hackman started in studying groups. So there was this they used to teach this equation by a psychologist named Ivan Steiner in the kind of 1960s and 70s, where he said it was AP is equal to PP minus PL. And what he meant by that, I've been trying to call this the Apple theory, but it didn't. My editors didn't like that much. So it was the actual productivity of a group is equal to the potential productivity, if we just added up the sort of potential of each member, minus process losses. And these process losses are the two things I talked about: the coordination losses and the social loafing. And that Richard Hackman looked at this and said, well, where are the process gains? Where are the times that we all actually try harder than we otherwise would because we're a member of this group? Where are the time that we learn something and we coordinate in such a way that we actually get synergy? And Steiner looked at him and said, I'll put it in my equation when somebody proves they exist. And so really, Hackman's research and those of us who have carried on this tradition have been the ones who are seeking these process gains. And they do exist. But I think the real lesson of this research is that they're easy to undermine, and that they really only exist when you set up a group for success in the first place with what we would call the success conditions for teams.
Well, what are some of those gains then? How did you prove Steiner wrong?
So, we can see that when groups share a clear, important goal that's also a little bit challenging, we get effects that not only do we try as hard as we can, but that we can push each other to new heights, right? And that we see this in a lot of studies of goal setting. So there's one of the ones I talk about in the book that's one of my favorites is a study of loggers in actually my home state of Washington, that the Weyerhaeuser Corporation found that their logging trucks were often driven out with only about 60% capacity pretty routinely. And, everyone thought this wasn't a great idea and was trying to figure out how we can, get to a higher capacity before we're driving these trucks out. And they worked with the loggers to say, what do you think is a realistic but challenging goal to do this? And that, when they all kind of talked about it among themselves, they said, well, we could probably do 90%. And that just by setting this 90% benchmark and everyone buying into it, they went from 60% to pretty close to 90% within 4 weeks of redoing this goal setting exercise. And so sometimes it's as simple as that, where we go from a situation where either the goal's not clear, we don't think it's personally important, or we don't think it's challenging but realistic. And that if we can create that shared sense, we'll all try a lot harder, and maybe even harder than we were trying before and would try alone. So it definitely can happen. And that just like, these great sports teams like the Dream Team, or, like a lot of these Duke basketball teams that Coach K was coaching, or Miles Davis's great quintets that we've alluded to, a group of people can create something that is more than what any one of them could have thought of or create. And I think we all know this to be true, but it's hard to find consistently scientifically because it is a little bit rare. And that really is because groups, so many organizations just aren't set up for group success, that they're, structured in ways that, are really about managing individuals, even though they're doing all their work in groups.
Yeah, I know I like to think about things from sports analogies as well. And the one that comes to mind is if you want to have a faster time on your bike or running, go with somebody who's faster than you.
Yeah.
And you will try to keep up and you will go faster than you would have on your own. So and that's not just drafting. That's it's mentally making you work harder than you might have. You won't take your foot off the gas like you might have thought.
Yeah, no, there's so many examples of not just one world record being set in a race, but multiple people breaking the same record if they had. So it's like there was one race I talked about in the book, and I'm forgetting the names of the runners, but 3 different people broke I think it was the 1500 meter dash in the same race, because they were all training to beat one another. So, I mean, this kind of like healthy competition and, being around people who raise the bar absolutely can make us try harder. And intuitively, we all know this exists. It's just hard to find consistently and to build into the everyday fabric of our work.
It's much different than when I was growing up and in cartoons would have the lead guy trying to throw nails under the tires of the people following him. Yeah. It's the opposite of that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So if the groups are the primary unit of human achievement, then what are most organizations still getting wrong about teamwork?
I think the most common thing is most organizations just are ignoring it. And so if I have to guess, and I know nothing about your organization, the 2 things that are most common are, one, that your goals really aren't clear enough or similarly understood by everybody on the team. And the way the sort of first line of defense against this is what one military leader I talked about is leaders should be the repeater in chief of these goals, of these norms. And that, if we don't keep reminding each other of, what mountain we're trying to climb, why we want to climb it, and, that we're going to have to really engage our full complement of effort in doing this, then it's likely our understandings of it are going to drift apart over time. And so even if you did this once really well, that clarifying goals, will at least spark helpful conversations about what else might be wrong. But often people do understand them slightly differently. And those even slight variations can make really big differences. So if we think about this in terms of coordinating, like we were going to meet someplace in California, right? If I say, hey, let's meet in California tomorrow, we don't have a chance, right? Like that's not nearly precise enough for us to do this. We not only have to name a city, we have to name a street and a corner and a really precise time, right? If we're going to get this right. But that I think so many organizations set goals at this level of saying, hey, let's meet in California tomorrow. Well, it's like, it's no wonder you guys end up in different places. That wasn't nearly precise enough for us to actually coordinate our actions. So goals are the first thing. And the second thing is the composition of groups. And more specifically, your groups are probably too big. That most organizations are getting 10, 15, 20 people in a room and asking them to come up with ideas or make decisions in like an hour-long meeting. Now, if I said, hey, let's have a dinner party tomorrow night, there's going to be 20 people there, and I'm going to set a rule that we only have to have one conversation and everyone else has to be quiet and pay attention to that one conversation. And I also want to make sure I know how everyone's doing, and we've got 1 hour. It's like, you've got no chance, right? Like that can't happen. There's no way that's ever going to work. But that's how we run meetings all the time, where, we get a whole bunch of people in the room. We're hoping we're going to get the benefit of their knowledge and perspectives, but we've created a situation where that's almost impossible. So, we have to really think differently about what the purposes of those moments where we're collaborating are, what kind of team we want to create. And again, these real teams work best when they are, their optimal number is 4.5, so between four or five members. But then anywhere from 3 to 7, we can have like meaningful conversations, meetings, really understand what everyone thinks and contributes. And then to have other mechanisms by which we are coordinating with the kind of peripheral or broader team. But if you've got a team of 30 people, you're running a small organization. That's not the kind of real team that we can all do everything together all the time. Nobody does that. Football teams don't do that. If you've got 50-man roster, like when you're practicing, you break up into smaller groups. That's how you do the work. And there's no sport that's very popular that's got more than 11 people on a team on the field at a time. And that even then, again, those are kind of usually like 2 or 3 smaller subunits that are working together. So yeah, I think that's probably what we're getting wrong in organizations. And there's a lot of other things that kind of fall out of that. But if you only give me 2 guesses, those are going to be my first 2.
Got it. Well, you can have as many guesses as you want, but we'll go to the next question. So I really love when you wrote in the book, you said that trying to produce synergy is like gardening. And it's more about setting the conditions as much as you're able than forcing something to grow. So, I mean, that was a great analogy that I thought you made there.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. Groups are just not this XY cause and effect, that human beings are too complicated, that even if you've got just 3 people, we can't predict what any group of 3 is going to do very long into the future, much less groups that are any larger than that. And that's because a whole bunch of stuff is happening to each of those individuals over time. That, if we're working with people, their situations aren't holding still. What their understandings, what they're thinking about, the competing responsibilities they have aren't holding still. So what we're doing when we're managing groups is we're creating these conditions that allow the group itself to, grow and develop like a plant, but also to learn and adapt and get better at being itself over time. And that we actually do see that, although a lot of people believe that, if you leave a team together too long, it's going to get stale and we're going to see performance decline, we don't see that very often. And that the time horizon, for like new product development teams, for instance, where we start seeing this kind of decline in performance is years. It's not months or days. It's like 3 or 4 years into their tenure. And that there's a real liability to groups being new and not having, really developed this set of conditions for themselves. That one study that Richard Hackman did found that over 70% of airline incidents, so bad things that happen in commercial aircrafts, happen on a crew's first flight together. And that, that even crews who had worked together but stayed up all night and were sleep deprived outperform new crews who were freshly rested. And that's really, there is this liability of newness in groups that we're going to do kind of our worst work whenever we're first put together. And that this is, again, another thing that a lot of organizations do wrong, that if you only have teams that are working together once and every single project you're mixing everything up every single time, yeah, there are some benefits to that. But there's also a real learning curve to learning to collaborate with new people every single time. And that these strong groups have developed these conditions to help them adapt that are the social norms, that are their communication patterns, that are their knowledge, their kind of meta knowledge of how other people like to work, what other people know, what they like, what they're good at. So I would keep your successful groups together as long as you can, and have a lot of this kind of fertilizing of the social norms and the conditions that are going to help your groups grow.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you brought that up. I was going to talk about it later because I've worked with some organizations that they feel like they just need to shake the snow globe up every few weeks or every few months, And it's like the team was just getting good at working with each other and knowing their strengths and weaknesses and communicating well. And then boom, we just blow the whole thing up and start over. So now I have a study that I'm going to reference because there was the meta-analysis you talked about in the book of about 11,000 teams that demonstrated that staying together leads to better performance. So, I know you want to inject new thoughts and new processes, but man, let's not shake the snow globe up too often.
Yeah. And I mean, there really is a benefit for, having a little bit of turnover in the team, but that you really want to keep it to a minimum rather than this blowing up all your teams and then reassembling them. So, having a new member every so often, it can help a group get new ideas. It can help them reconsider and think about their social norms and how they're working together. But, really wholesale change where we're mixing up these teams all the time generally is hurting you rather than helping you.
I mean, if you go back to your sweet spot of 4.5 people on a team, you say it's 4, then if you just change that one team member, that's 25% disruption. Yep. That's a pretty big number, even just making one change. Yeah. No, I mean, if we think about, bands or, basketball teams or anything that have these kind of small numbers, they're significant. Like if you're a fan of a basketball team, every time a starter turns over and, how much of a difference that can make and that how much we have to kind of adjust how everyone else is doing things to adjust for any new team member. That concludes part 1 of my conversation with Dr. Colin Fisher, professor, speaker, and author of The Collective Edge. Coming up in part 2, Colin explains why a group composed of the most talented people won't necessarily be the best team.
Skills matter more than sort of absolute level of talent. And so, I think, again, this kind of sports metaphor helps us. If we create an all-star team, but everyone plays the same position and we don't actually think about what people are good at and whether they're providing all the skills necessary, and that when I talked about the Scream team, so the 2004 U.S. men's Olympic basketball team that got the bronze medal, the first one in a long time not to get the gold medal, that they put together the biggest names. So people who may have seemed like they were the most talented, but they didn't actually think about what the difference between Olympic basketball and NBA basketball was and how, Olympic basketball, they had different defensive rules. You could play zone defense back then, and that it put a lot bigger premium at the time on 3-point shooting. And they just, they took the biggest names they could find. They didn't think about 3-point shooting hardly at all. They didn't think about defense hardly at all. And so you ended up with a bunch of people who were very talented, but didn't have the right skills for that task. And so that kind of thinking about talent won't really help you.
Thanks for listening to The Conversation. To find out more about Clint, go to clintonmpaget.com and pick up Clint's book, How Teams Triumph, Managing by Commitment, at Amazon. The Conversation with Clinton M. Paget is a production of Forbes Books.